The year was 865 AD, and the morning mist hung thick over the coastal village of Lindisfarne, like a shroud when young Aelthryth heard the first screams. She had been drawing water from the well, her calloused hands working the rope with practiced ease, when the sound of splintering wood echoed across the settlement. The bucket fell from her grip, splashing into the dark water below as she spun toward the harbour. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her days. Dozens of longships, with carved dragon heads cutting through the fog, their striped sails billowing in the dawn wind. And on the decks, hundreds of armed warriors raising their axes to the sky. Within minutes, everything Aelthryth had ever known ceased to exist. The Vikings poured into the village like a human flood, their war cries mixing with the panicked shouts of fishermen scrambling for weapons they didn't have. She watched her father, a barrel maker named Oswald, grab a hammer from his workshop and charge at 3 raiders who were kicking in their neighbour's door. He managed one swing before a bearded giant with arms thick as tree trunks drove a spear through his chest. Her mother's scream cut through the chaos, and then Aelthryth was running, her feet pounding against the muddy path between burning houses, not knowing where to go, but understanding with perfect clarity that staying meant death or something worse. But the truth of what happened to women like Aelthryth during the Viking raids on England reveals a story far more complex and disturbing than the simple pillage and burn narrative most people imagine. Between the years 793 and 1066 AD, wave after wave of Scandinavian raiders descended on the British Isles, and while history books often focus on the battles, the monasteries looted, and the kingdoms that fell, the experiences of thousands of captured women remain one of the most shocking and least understood aspects of this brutal period. Aelthryth didn't make it to the forest. A hand caught her hair, yanking her backward with such force that her feet left the ground. She crashed onto her back, the air knocked from her lungs, staring up at a man whose face was partially obscured by a metal helmet. He was younger than her father, perhaps 25 years old, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. He shouted something in a language she didn't understand, then dragged her by the arm toward the beach, where other women and girls were being herded like cattle. Some were her friends, people she had known her entire life. Old Edith, who made the best bread in the village, Sinew-Eyes, who was barely 14, the priest's sister, whose name was Hilda, and who had always been kind to the orphaned children. The selection process began almost immediately, and this is where the historical reality becomes particularly disturbing. Contemporary accounts from Anglo-Saxon chronicles and later Norse sagas describe how Viking raiders categorized their female captives based on age, health, and appearance. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic. Women who were too old, too sick, or too young to be useful were often killed on the spot to avoid slowing down the raiding party. Those who fought back violently met the same fate, but women like Aelthryth, who were young, healthy, and hadn't yet borne children, were considered valuable commodities worth more alive than dead. A grizzled warrior with grey streaks in his braided beard walked among the captured women, pointing at some and dismissing others with a wave of his hand. When he reached Aelthryth, he grabbed her jaw, turning her head from side to side, examining her teeth like one might inspect a horse. He squeezed her upper arm, testing the muscle there, then nodded to her captor and moved on. She had passed some kind of test, though she didn't yet understand what that meant. The women who weren't selected were pushed into a separate group, and Aelthryth watched in horror as several warriors led them behind the burning church. The screams that followed told her everything she needed to know about their fate. The journey to the ships was a blur of smoke and blood. The Vikings worked with terrifying efficiency, loading their longships with everything of value: silver from the church, livestock that could survive the sea crossing, barrels of salted fish, bolts of cloth, and human cargo. Aelthryth was pushed into a ship with approximately 40 other women, ranging in age from about 12 to perhaps 35. They were made to sit in the center of the vessel, surrounded by stolen goods and warriors who joked with each other in their incomprehensible language. As the ship pushed away from the shore, Aelthryth looked back at the only home she had ever known. Every building was either burning or already reduced to ash. Bodies lay scattered along the beach. The life she had woken up to that morning no longer existed. What happened next reveals one of the most shocking aspects of Viking raiding culture that modern historians have pieced together from multiple sources, including archaeological evidence, genetic studies, and written accounts from both sides. The voyage across the North Sea took approximately 3 days under favorable conditions, and during this time, the captive women existed in a state of suspended terror, not knowing where they were being taken or what would happen to them. Some of the younger raiders watched the women constantly, and there are documented accounts suggesting that sexual assault did occur on these journeys, though the ship's commander typically forbade it because damaged goods fetched lower prices at market. Market. That word would have been meaningless to Aelthryth at the time, but it was the reality awaiting her. The Vikings who raided England weren't just warriors, they were traders operating within a vast commercial network that stretched from Dublin to Constantinople, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. And one of their most profitable commodities was enslaved people, particularly women, from England, Ireland, and Scotland. Recent DNA analysis of burial sites in Scandinavia has confirmed what the historical sources suggested. Thousands of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon women ended up in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark during the Viking Age, and the manner of their arrival was anything but voluntary. When Aelthryth's ship finally made landfall, it wasn't in some remote coastal village as she might have expected. Instead, they arrived at what Norse sources called a kaupang, a trading centre bustling with activity. This particular settlement, located in what is now western Norway, had perhaps 500 permanent residents, but during trading season swelled to several thousand as merchants arrived from across the known world. There were Frankish traders selling wine and weapons, Arab merchants with silk and spices, and scores of Viking crews unloading the plunder from their raids. And there were slaves everywhere, perhaps accounting for a quarter of the people Aelthryth could see. The women from her village were taken to a large wooden building near the harbour, a kind of holding pen where they would wait until the slave market opened in 2 days. Here, Aelthryth got her first real look at the system, that would define her existence. There were already dozens of slaves in the building, men and women from various raids, speaking different languages. An older woman, who spoke some Anglo-Saxon, explained the situation in a flat, emotionless voice. They would be sold. The pretty ones would likely become concubines to wealthy men. The strong ones would work as farm laborers. The clever ones might end up as household servants. Some might be resold to traders heading east. And yes, she confirmed when Aelthryth asked, they were slaves for life, unless their owner chose to free them, which rarely happened. The market itself was held in an open area near the center of the settlement, and this is where historical accounts and archaeological evidence paint a particularly disturbing picture of what enslaved women endured. Buyers would examine the merchandise thoroughly, and contemporary descriptions make it clear this wasn't a dignified process. Women were made to strip so that buyers could check for diseases, scars, or signs of pregnancy. They were made to walk, to lift heavy objects, to demonstrate their fitness. Those who spoke some Norse had to answer questions about their skills. Could they weave? Could they cook? Could they work leather? Had they borne children before? The questions that weren't asked out loud hung in the air regardless. Aelthryth was purchased by a man named Thorstein, a wealthy landowner whose farm was located several days' journey inland. He paid what witnesses suggested was a premium price, the equivalent value of 8 milk cows, which was significant but not extraordinary. The most beautiful women could fetch twice that amount. Thorstein was perhaps 40 years old, with a wife named Gunhild and 3 children. As Aelthryth would learn, his household already included 2 other enslaved women from previous raids, one from Ireland and another from Scotland. This was common. Prosperous Viking-age households frequently owned between 2 and 10 slaves, with the very wealthy possessing significantly more. The reality of slave life in Viking-age Scandinavia was complex and varied significantly depending on one's owner, but certain patterns emerge from the historical record that are genuinely shocking to modern sensibilities. Enslaved women occupied the lowest rung of society, below even the poorest free person, and had essentially no legal rights. They could not own property, could not marry without permission, and could not testify in legal proceedings. More disturbingly, they could not refuse sexual advances from their owners. This last point is crucial to understanding what happened to thousands of captured English women. In Thorstein's household, Aelthryth's daily life consisted of back-breaking labor from before dawn until after dark. She milked cows, churned butter, wove cloth, hauled water, cleaned the longhouse, helped with the cooking, and performed any other task demanded of her. The work itself, while exhausting, wasn't necessarily worse than what she had done as a free woman in England. What made her situation unbearable was the absolute lack of autonomy and the constant threat of violence. Thorstein's wife Gunhild treated the slave women with casual cruelty, cuffing them for small mistakes and assigning the most degrading tasks as punishment for perceived slights. The other household members, including the children, were free to order the slaves around or strike them with impunity. But it was the nights that revealed the most disturbing aspect of life for enslaved women in Viking society. Thorstein, like many Norse men of his class, considered sexual access to his female slaves a normal privilege of ownership. Historical sources, including the laws of Viking Age Scandinavia, make it clear that this was not only common, but legally sanctioned. A man who had sex with someone else's female slave could be prosecuted for property damage, but an owner doing the same with his own slave was exercising his rights. For women like Aelthryth, this meant living in constant fear of their owner's desires, with no recourse and no protection. The legal codes of the time actually contain provisions that reveal just how normalized this was. If an enslaved woman became pregnant by her owner, the child was born into slavery unless the owner chose to acknowledge it and grant freedom. Some men did this, particularly if they had no legitimate male heirs, but many did not. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age burials have uncovered the remains of women who appear to have been slaves, buried in ways that suggest they were killed when their owner died, possibly to serve them in the afterlife. Some of these women show signs of violent death, and some of the graves include the remains of infants or young children. Aelthryth's first winter in Scandinavia was perhaps the hardest period of her life. The darkness and cold were unlike anything she had experienced in England, and the isolation was crushing. She missed her family, her village, her language, her God. The small church in Lindisfarne had been the center of her spiritual life, and here, surrounded by people who worshipped Thor and Odin, she felt utterly alone. The Irish slave, whose name was Muireann, tried to comfort her, explaining that the pain would dull with time, that survival required accepting the reality of their situation. But Muireann also whispered something else late at night when the household was asleep. Some slaves did eventually gain their freedom, and some even managed to escape. The paths to freedom for enslaved women in Viking society were limited, but they did exist, and this is where the story takes some unexpected turns that historical sources have documented. The most common way was manumission, where an owner voluntarily freed a slave. This might happen if the slave had provided exceptionally good service for many years, if the owner experienced a religious conversion to Christianity, which became increasingly common after the year 1000, or if a male slave or freed person could scrape together enough resources to purchase their companion's freedom. Some women achieved freedom by bearing their owner's child and being elevated to the status of concubine with rights, though this was a dangerous gamble that often ended badly. Escape was theoretically possible, but incredibly difficult. A woman who ran away in Viking Age Scandinavia had nowhere to go. She didn't speak the language, didn't know the land, had no resources, and would be immediately recognizable as a foreigner. The laws were harsh on escaped slaves. Anyone who sheltered a runaway could be prosecuted, and captured runaways faced brutal punishment or death. Despite this, some women did attempt it. Archaeological evidence and saga accounts mention enslaved people fleeing to remote areas, sometimes forming small communities of outcasts, though most were eventually recaptured or died from exposure and starvation. Aelthryth chose a different path, one that reveals yet another shocking aspect of how Viking society operated. After approximately 2 years of enslavement, during which time she had learned to speak basic Norse, and had borne Thorstein a daughter who was immediately taken away and given to a childless couple in a neighboring farm, she was approached by a freeman named Bjorn, who worked on Thorstein's land. Bjorn was not wealthy, nor was he particularly influential, but he had noticed Aelthryth and wanted to take her as his wife. In Viking society, even slaves could technically marry if their owner permitted it, though the children of such unions were born into slavery unless the owner granted them freedom. Bjorn negotiated with Thorstein for months, offering his labor in exchange for Aelthryth's hand. Finally, Thorstein agreed on the condition that Bjorn work for him for 3 additional years, without payment beyond basic provisions. It was a harsh bargain, and Aelthryth would remain technically enslaved during this period, but it represented a form of hope. Bjorn was kind to her in ways that Thorstein had never been, and when their son was born in the 3rd year of Bjorn's service, Thorstein surprised everyone by granting the child freedom. This wasn't pure generosity. The boy would be useful as he grew, and a free child owed obligations to the man who had granted his freedom. Historical records suggest that Aelthryth's experience, while undoubtedly traumatic, was actually among the better outcomes for English women captured during the Viking raids. Many others fared far worse. Some ended up in the trade networks that moved enslaved people eastward through Russia to the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad, where English and Irish slaves were exotic commodities commanding high prices. Arab travelers who visited Viking trading posts in the 9th and 10th centuries left accounts describing markets filled with fair-haired slaves from the north, many of them women and children, being sold to merchants who would transport them thousands of miles from their homes. Others were passed from owner to owner, never finding stability or safety. Some died young from the harsh conditions, untreated diseases, or complications from childbirth. Some took their own lives, choosing death over continued enslavement. The sagas occasionally mention such cases, usually in passing, as if the suicide of a slave was barely worth recording. And some women were killed for trivial reasons, because an owner was angry or drunk, or simply felt like it, and faced no legal consequences, because destroying one's own property was not a crime. By the year 878 AD, 13 years after Aelthryth's capture, the political situation in England had shifted dramatically. King Alfred of Wessex had managed to halt the Viking advance at the Battle of Edington, and negotiations were underway that would establish the Danelaw, a region of England where Viking law and customs would be officially recognized. This treaty had implications that few modern people appreciate. It essentially legitimized the enslavement of English people by Vikings and created a legal framework where the traffic in slaves could continue with official sanction, but it also created opportunities. As Viking warriors began to settle permanently in England, establishing farms and families in the Danelaw, some brought their enslaved English servants with them. This created complex situations where enslaved English people were living in England under the control of Viking settlers. Some of these slaves eventually gained freedom as the Viking settlers assimilated into English society and converted to Christianity. The Christian Church, despite its many failings, did generally oppose slavery, and as Viking communities in England became Christianized, the practice slowly declined. For Aelthryth, these distant political changes meant little in her daily life. By 880 AD, She was approximately 30 years old, had borne Bjorn 3 children, and had finally been granted formal freedom by Thorstein, who was now an elderly man experiencing the religious doubts that came with age and the influence of Christian missionaries who had begun appearing in the region. Her freedom came with conditions. She and her family had to remain on Thorstein's land and continue working it, and they owed him a portion of their produce each year. But she was no longer a slave. She could not be sold. She could not be killed with impunity. She had some legal rights, though far fewer than someone born free. The genetic legacy of women like Aelthryth is written in the DNA of modern Scandinavians. Recent studies analyzing the genomes of people living in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have found surprisingly high levels of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon maternal lineage, meaning that a significant percentage of modern Scandinavians descend from women who were brought from the British Isles